Welcome to the video Spring Boot add roles to user. I am Nam Amin from codejava.net. Through this video, you will learn how to implement user role assignment function in a Spring Boot application. In details, I will show you how to create a role entity class and role repository interface, how to add roles to user in unit test, how to add default role to user in registration, and how to update roles of user in web form. Note that in this video, I will start with a Spring Boot project which is developed in the video Spring Boot registration and login with database. So I recommend you to follow that video before coming to this one. We will be working on a Java project using the following technologies: Spring Boot Web, Spring Data JPA with Hibernate framework, Spring Security, Thymeleaf, and MySQL Database. And I'm using the following software programs: Java Development Kit, OpenJDK, Spring Tools with IDE, MySQL Server, and MySQL Workbench. Alright, let's start with this Spring Boot project. It is for user registration and login. Let me start this Spring Boot application. You see, this is the main class. This is the user entity class with the fields ID, email, password, first name, last name. This is a Spring Security configuration file for authentication. Here you see. Okay, the application has started. Yeah, okay. Now let me access this Spring Boot application in Chrome browser here. HTTP localhost port number 8080. Enter. Okay. And in this application, I can register a new user here. Okay. Email. Name at codejava.net. Password. First name. Last name. Click sign up. Okay. You have signed up successfully. And in the database, you can see here in MySQL Workbench, the database CodeJavaDB here, the user table here, select rows, and you can see we have a new row for the newly created user Nam Amin here. Okay, now let me log in. Okay, I am in, and after I have logged in successfully, it shows the users listing page, and currently there's only one user Nam Amin here. So that's the functionality of the existing Spring Boot application. Now we are going to update the project so a user can be assigned one or more roles. So there will be a new table in the database, the rows table with two columns, ID and name here. And you know the entity relationship between users and roles is many to many. A user can be assigned one or more roles and a role can be assigned to one or more users. So that's why we need to have an intermediate table users roles here. Come back to the project and let's stop the application for now. And we create a new entity class here, new class role. And in this entity class, we have just two fields that are ID and name. And we use the entity annotation and the table annotation to map with the table rows in the database rows here. And for the ID field here, we specify the annotation ID and generated value with the strategy is generation type dot identity. So I think you are very familiar with these annotations. Okay, and for the field name, we use a column annotation and specify the attribute nullable equal false, and the maximum length is about 45 characters for the row name. And then generate the getter and setter methods for the fields in the class ID and name. Generate. Okay. And we need to have some constructors here. Generate constructor using fields here. Generate. Okay. We need to have some constructors. This constructor takes only role name. Okay. And another constructor that takes only row ID. Here, okay. And another constructor that takes ID and name. And default constructor which is required by Hibernate, like this. Okay, that's the code for the row entity class. And in the user entity class, we need to specify the many-to-many entity relationship with the rows. Okay, so here we declare a set collection of row. Here, set row rows equal new hash set here. Okay, and we need to use the annotation many-to-many, and also use the annotation join table here, and we specify some attributes for the join table name. The join table name is users underscore rows, and the join column is join column name is user underscore id, and reverse join column is the row underscore id. Okay, that's for the many-to-many annotation. My mistake. We need to add a many-to-many annotation like this. Okay, so this is a mapping for the many-to-many entity relationship between user and row. Yeah. Okay, and then we generate a getter and setter method for the set collection here, rows here, generate, and we also add a new method for adding a new row to this user. Add row, and parameter is a row object here. This rows add row. Okay, that's it. For the entity classes row and user. Now we can start the application to let Hibernate framework generate the tables. As in the application properties file, we specify the attribute Hibernate DDL auto equal update here. Okay, and in the console view, here you see it executed the SQL statements to create the table rows here, and the intermediate table users underscore rows here. And let me check in the MySQL Workbench. Here, refresh the database. Okay, and you see the new table rows here with two columns, ID and name, and the intermediate table users and rows here to element the many-to-many entity relationship between user and row here. Perfect, right? Next, let's create the row repository interface to use Spring Data JPA. So create a new interface here, a row repository, and extend the JPA or repository interface. Extends JPA repository here with the type of the entity is a row and type of the ID is long. Okay, and then we write a unit test class for test creating some rows, new class in the test source directory here. The class name is row repository test. Okay, this is a Spring Data JPA test, so we need to use the annotation Data JPA test. and we want to execute the SQL statement against the real database. So we set this annotation: auto configure test database replace equal none. And we want that Hibernate we commit the data, not rollback, so we specify the annotation rollback false. Yeah, and in this test class, sorry, you need to add import for the none attribute here, none value here. Okay, replace none. Okay, and in this test class we need to have a reference to the row or repository here. Okay, report, and we write a test method, a JUnit test method, test create rows. Okay, then we create some row objects here. Row user is a new row, and passing the name is user, and row admin equal new row admin, and row customer equal new row customer. And then we proceed these three row objects into the database repo. Save all here. List of user, admin, and customer. And then we assert this test method like this repo file. We get all the row objects from the database list rows, and we assert that the size of the list row is equal to 3, because here we have 3 row objects. List rows dot get size and is equal to 3. That's it. Okay, and before running this test method, let me check in the database in the rows table here. Okay, you see the table is empty now. Now let me run this JUnit test method. Run as JUnit test. Okay, the test has been successful, and in the console you can see it prints some SQL statements insert into rows table here 3 times for 3 row objects here. So far so good. And let me check in the database here. Execute the select SQL statement here, and you see now we have 3 rows inserted into the rows table here: user, admin, and customer. Next, let's code a new unit test for persisting a user object associated with a row. So in the project we have the user repository test class here. Okay, and write a new test method. Test public void test create a new user. Sorry, the method name should be test add row to new user. Okay, and in this test class we need to have a reference to a row repository, so we change this name to user repo. Auto wire private row repository row repo. Okay, and we copy this code to create a new user object here. Okay, email is ravi.kuma@gmail.com. Password ravi2020. First name Ravi, last name Kuma. and we need to get a row object by name. So in the row repository interface here, we declare a new method here, public row file by name, with parameter is the row name. Okay, and we use a custom query like this: select from row where dot name equal to the value of the first parameter, which is the name here. Okay, here in the test method here, we get a row object by name like this, row repo file by name, and we want to assign the row user to this new user object. Okay, row user, and then we add this row object to the user object, row user dot add row user here, and then we proceed this user object user repo save user. Okay, and we return a new saved user object here, and we assert this test method like this: save user get row size is equal to 1, because this user object is associated with a row object. Okay, now save the change, and before running this test method, let me check in the database. Here in the user table, we have just only one user here, and in the intermediate table users rows here, it is empty. Okay, now let me run this test method, run as unit test. Okay, the test has been successful, and you can see it prints the SQL statement to select a row from the rows table by name here, and then insert a new user to the user table, and then insert a new row into the intermediate table users and rows here. Now let me check the MySQL database here in the users table. Here you see we got a new row for the user Ravi Kumar inserted here. The password is not encoded because I don't use the Spring Security password encoder. No issue. And in the users rows table here, and you see a new row got inserted with user ID 2 and row ID 1 here. User ID 2 is the ID of the new user here, and row ID 1 is a row user here. Perfect, right? And next, let's code another test method for testing add two rows to an existing user. Okay, is a new test method, public void test add rows to existing user. Okay, and firstly we need to get a user by ID, user repo file by ID, and we pass the ID 1 as a long value, and get okay, this user with ID 1 in the database is user Nam Ha Minh here. Okay, and then we get two row objects from the database. We want to assign the row admin and customer to this user. So here we can use this code to get the row user. Okay, and instead of getting a new row object like this, we can also specify row ID like this: row admin equal new row, and we pass ID. Here in the database, the row admin has the ID 2 here, you see, and we pass the ID 2 here, and then we put add the row admin to this user object, and then we proceed the user object, and then we assert that this user has 2 rows assigned here. Okay, that's it. And run this test method, run as unit test. Okay, successful, and you see it prints the SQL statement to select user by ID here, and then select row by name here, and then select a row by user ID here, and insert into users rows table here, 2 rows into the intermediate table. Now let me check the database in the rows table, in the users rows table here. So we got 2 new rows inserted for the user ID 1 here, aside the row ID 1 and 2 here. ID 1 and 2 are the rows user and admin here, exactly. Next, we update the user's listing page here to display the rows of the user in the table. Let me refresh this page. Okay, I have to log in. Okay, you see we have 2 users here, Nama Ming and Ravi Kumar. Now come back to the project and open the HTML page for users here, and we add a new column for the rows here, the rows, and we display the rows of the user here, user.rows, because in the user entity class we have the collection rows. Here you see in the user entity class we have the collection rows here, and in the row entity class we need to override the toString method, so it will display the row name. Generate toString, just return the row name, this name. Okay, and test, refresh, log in again. Okay, now you see the row names appear here. For the user Nama Ming has 2 rows, admin and user, and the user Ravi Kumar has 1 row user here. Next, we will show the row names of the currently login user after the username here. Okay, come back to the project and open the user's HTML page, and we have the code that displays the full name of the currently login user. Full name is a property in the user details class here, custom user details here. This class wraps the user entity class here, and the method get full name here. Okay, so to display the row names of the currently login user, we can use Thymeleaf security with HTML code like this, in the span tag like this, sec authentication equal principal dot authorities, yeah, rows, and we need to add XML namespace for Thymeleaf adjust Spring security here. Note that in the Maven project file you need to have the dependency for Thymeleaf adjust Spring security file like this. Okay, so this is a XML namespace, so you won't get the warning of the IDE. Okay. The prefix should be sec here. Okay. And then in the user details class, custom user details class, in the method get authorities. Yeah, this method get authorities will be called when we use this attribute principal.authorities. Yeah, so we need to implement the code here. Firstly, we need to get the rows from the user. Get rows here. Assign to a set of rows here, and we declare a list of simple granted authority here. Authorities here equal new array list. Okay, and we return the list authorities here, and we iterate through each row object is a row set here. Rows, we add new simple granted authority object to the list here. Add new simple granted authority and passing the row name, row get name. That's it for the get authorities method in the user details class. Okay, save the changes, and now we test, refresh and log in. We got an error here. You see, failed to lazily initialize a collection of row user.rows. Yeah, that means in the user entity class we need to specify the attribute fetch type for this many-to-many relationship. So when a user object is loaded, the associated row objects will be loaded as well. So here we specify fetch equal fetch type eager. Okay, save the change. Okay, and test again. Okay, now you see it displays the row names of the currently login user here, Nam Ming, and followed by the row names here. Let me sign out and log in as the user Ravi Kumar, ravi.kumar@gmail.com. I can't log in because in the database the user Ravi Kumar was created in unit test without encoded password, as you can see here. So let me copy the same password as the user Namaming here. Okay, and apply, finish. Okay, log in again. Okay, I have logged in successfully as the user Ravi Kumar, and you can see the role name is user here. Exactly. Next, we are going to update the user registration process to assign the default role to a new user. Okay, come back to the project, and this is a Spring MVC controller class that handles all the requests to the application REST, shows app form and process registration here. It's better to create a service class for the user business. So I create a new class here, user service annotation, and we move the code in the controller here, the user repository here, and the business method save user with default row. And we copy the code that persists the user object here. User here. And we need to have a reference of row repository, private row repository here, row repo, and change this name to user repo. Okay, and we want that when the new user is registered, we assign the default row is user row. So we get the user row by row name here, row repo file by name user, row user, and we add this row to the new user object, user add row. Okay, you see, and in the controller class we call we need to have no reference to the service here, user service, and here we call service save user with default row here and passing the user object. That's it. And here for the list users functionality here, we move the code here, public list user list all, and we just return user repo file all. Okay, and we call service list all here. Okay, save the changes, and now we can test the user registration process that saves the user with default row. Okay, now I will rest a new user email Mike gets mike.guest@gmail.com, password first name Mike, last name gets. Okay, and click sign up. Okay, you have signed up successfully. Let me check in the database. In the user table, you see a new row inserted for the user Mike gets there, and in the users rows table, you see we have a new association with user ID 3 and row ID 1 here. ID 3 is new user my guest here, and ID 1 is a row user here exactly. And I will log in as the new user Mike gets here. Okay, you see the row name of the user my guest is user here. The default row assigned to a new user after registration here, user. And now I will show you how to implement the edit user function that allows us to update the rows of a user visually on a web form. Okay, come back to the project, and firstly we update the user listing table to add a edit button after the rows here. I just see a hyperlink for editing a user here. Edit, and the URL is th:/sref equal to /users/ and edit, and followed by the user ID, user.id. Okay, refresh. We got an error here. Sorry. Okay, we have the edit hyperlink here. Click and we got the white label error paste because no handler method. So we code the handler method in the controller class here. Red mapping /user/edit and path variable ID. public string edit user, and we map the value of the ID of user in the URL. As you can see, we have the ID 2 in the URL here, edit/id2. So we use the path variable annotation ID and bind to a variable long ID and a model object from Spring MVC. Okay, now in this method we return the logical view name to the user form. And we need to implement a new method in the service class to get a user object by ID. Public user get long ID, and we return user repo file by ID, passing the user ID and get. Okay, and very simple. And here we call service get ID, return a user object, and we put this user object onto the model and attribute user. Okay, and in this project we have the sign up form here. We can reuse the code in this HTML page for the edit user form. Copy, paste, and change the name to user_form, and we modify the code. The title is edit user, the heading is edit user, and the action of the form is now /user/save, and the binding object is user. Okay, email, password, first name, last name. The submit button is update, and for editing we need to have a hidden field that binds to the ID property of the user entity object. Input type equal hidden, and th field bind to the field ID. Okay, save the change, and we can test the edit user form now. Okay, you see the edit form appears for the user with ID 2 with the email Ravi Kumar, first name Ravi, last name Kumar. And now we need to display the assigned rows to this user after the last name here. Okay, and in the user service class we need to have method that returns a list of rows here, public list row get rows, and simply return row repo file. And in the handler method edit user here we need to get a list of row objects, service get rows here, list rows, and we put this list onto the model list rows here. So in the view we can show all the rows. Okay, save the changes for the Java code, and for the HTML code with Thymeleaf, we put a new div section for the rows of the user. Okay, so the label is assigned rows, and here we use Thymeleaf each loop th block th each row object in the list rows here. List rows we send in the handler method here, list rows here. And then for each row object we generate input of type checkbox. Okay, and then we bind this input to the few rows of the user entity class. The few rows here. Okay, and then we set the value for the checkbox is row.id, and the text for this checkbox th text equal row.name. Okay, save the change and refresh the edit user form. You can see the aside rows for the user Ravi Kumar. You can see the row user is checked here, meaning that this user is assigned the row user here. We need to have some extra white space among the rows name. So here we can specify the bootstrap class Amazon 2. Okay, refresh. You see it looks better, right? So here on this edit user form we can change the rows for the user by check or uncheck the row names. Okay, so far so good. Let me go to the user listing page, list underscore users. I need to log in. Okay, and click edit for the user Mike gets who has a row user here. Edit, you can see the row user is selected here. And go back and edit the user Nam Ha Minh with 2 rows, admin and user here. Edit, you see the 2 rows user and admin are checked here. So as you can see, Thymeleaf does all the binding work for you. You just by the checkbox to the field here and set the value and set the text here, and Thymeleaf does all the things behind the scene for you. So it is very simple. Now let's implement the handler method for saving the user details with the updated rows. In the form we have the action is /user/save here. Okay, and then we code a new handler method in the controller class here. Post mapping with the URL like this: public string save user object that maps to the user on the form. Okay, and here we call the service method to save the user. It is different than the save user with default role here. Public void save user object here, and we just copy the code that encodes the user password, and we delete the code that adds the default roles. Okay, that's it for the save method. And in the handler method we call service save user, and we return the a redirection to the user listing page. Return redirect list users. Okay, that's it. Save all the changes, and now we can test update user function. Okay, now let me log in. List users, login. Okay, and let me change, update the rows for the user Ravi Kumar here. Edit, and I select all 3 rows here. You see all 3 rows user, admin and customer are checked, and I enter password and click update. Okay, successful. And now you can see the row names for the user Ravi Kumar is customer, user and admin here. Perfect, right? Let me check in the database. In the row users rows table here, for the user ID to Ravi Kumar we have 3 associations with the row ID 1, row ID 2 and row ID 3 here. Exactly, perfect. Now let me edit another username admin. Here I change the role to only customer here, and I need to enter password. Okay, update. Okay, successful, and you see the role of the username admin got updated to only customer here. And let me check in the database for the username admin with ID 1 here. ID 1, and you see with user ID 1 it has only one association with the row ID 3, which is the row customer here. So that's how to update the rows for user in a web form. You see, it is very simple using Thymeleaf and Spring Boot. You just use a checkbox like this and implement the handler method like this, and Thymeleaf and Spring Boot that do everything for you.